And according to Michael Shaw from freedomadvocates.org and Bezmenov, once you've stolen a generation of children, well, what are you actually doing with them? You're indoctrinating them via the administrator-induced programs of critical race theory nonsense, social justice nonsense, gender ideology nonsense, and climate change nonsense, all a part of the new sustainable education programs covered under Agenda 21, New World Order, One World Government, Global Governance Implementation Plan. Well, like most things, none of this is happening without financing. So where does the money come from to indoctrinate millions of children worldwide and thousands of new administrators with their woke social justice reform propaganda? Well, the money comes from where you would expect, central banks, and flows to the commercial banks, and then it is redistributed to companies that agree with these 17 Sustainable Development Goals and ESGs and 3 E's as set by the United Nations. And companies that have galvanized the wealth and resources of the entire world through the consolidating of entire industries under their control, managing in some instances over 10 trillion in assets. Of course, we'd be talking about firms such as Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and Berkshire Hathaway, who then require all the companies under their control to either go woke or go broke, forcing them to adopt all these inclusive social justice policy nonsense wholesale. If companies fail to comply with the SDG goals or the 3 E's or the ESGs, they will no longer receive funding. In this next clip, Vivek Ramaswamy, author of Nations of Victims, describes exactly how it works.
Firms like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, 3 of the largest asset managers in the world right there, together managing over $20 trillion, that's more than the GDP of the United States. What they do is they aggregate the money of everyday citizens. They invest in companies across corporate America and tell those companies that you have to abide by these climate goals, that you have to abide by these emissions caps, that you have to abide by these diversity, equity, inclusion standards and racial quota systems in your boardrooms. And if you don't, then we're going to fire you as CEO. Then we're going to take seats on your board. Then we're going to cut your pay. And that's the lurking variable behind the woke capitalist epidemic, which is really the capital behind the scenes that's forcing companies through shareholder pressure to adopt these one-sided politicized agendas.
And so the largest asset management companies that have galvanized the wealth and resources of the entire world, who collectively manage over 20 trillion in assets. Again, we're talking about Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and Berkshire Hathaway, are requiring all the companies that are under their control to go woke or go broke, forcing them to adopt all these environmental, inclusive, social justice nonsense policies wholesale. If companies fail to comply with the SDG goals or the ESG goals or the 3 E goals, these policies include climate goals, emission caps, diversity, equity, and inclusivity standards, racial quota standards, and boardrooms industry-wide. And so if they don't go along with these new policies, well, what happens? Well, they'll be removed as CEO. They'll replace members of their board. They'll reduce their pay, marginalize their influence, and blacklist them from getting jobs in other industries or the industries they're currently employed in. And if we don't understand how it's possible to do all of this at the same time worldwide, then we fail to understand the significance of these multinational institutional asset managers who own all the major corporations in the entire world. To understand their wealth and power, let's take a quick look inside an overview of BlackRock.
It is likely you have never heard of BlackRock. BlackRock was founded in 1988 by Larry Fink, along with Robert Capito, Susan Wagner, Barbara Novick, Ben Golub, Hugh Frater, Ralph Schlosstein, and Keith Anderson. The firm adopted the name BlackRock in 1992. Sometime later that same year, Fink became the chairman and CEO of BlackRock Inc., the world's largest asset manager. The assets in the roster exceed the value of $9 trillion, and their net worth is equal to half of America's GDP. In fact, own and control the entire world. And how does this one company in America influence every industry and sector in the world? While there appear to be hundreds of competing brands on the market, the truth is, larger parent companies actually own multiple smaller brands. 2 companies are consistently listed among the top institutional holders of these parent companies: the Vanguard Group Inc. and BlackRock Inc. In virtually every major company, you find BlackRock among the top 10 institutional investors. With its massive reach, BlackRock is essentially the fourth branch of government, influencing policies and decisions and even lending money to the central bank and Federal Reserve, holding incredible power, not just in America, but all over the world. BlackRock currently owns 18% of Fox, 16% of CBS, and 13% of Comcast, which in turn owns NBC, MSNBC, and Sky. The same is true for Google, a tech giant currently worth $853 billion. Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter are also not exempt, and neither is Disney. Thanks to their incredibly diverse investment portfolio in media alone, BlackRock essentially owns 90% of the world's media. If any of those companies wanted to make a decision, they would have to also consult with BlackRock before doing so. If we take into account BlackRock's ownership over Western media, banks, e-commerce stores, social media, food and beverages, and many, many more industries, with the trajectory BlackRock has been on, it seems their influence will only grow as they acquire more and more of the world to control. If such is the case, we are headed into a dystopian world where corporations have more power than governments.
Here's a glance at the extent of BlackRock's power and influence over every major corporation in the world. Keep in mind that BlackRock itself, their assets are managed by an even larger firm, Vanguard.
Vanguard and BlackRock. The power of these two companies is something we can barely imagine. Not only are they the largest institutional investors of every major company on Earth, they also own the other institutional investors of those companies, giving them a complete monopoly. That by 2028, both companies will collectively manage about $20 trillion in investments, and in the process will own almost everything on Earth. They own Bayer, the parent company of Monsanto, the world's largest seed producer, which produces 90% of all the cotton seed on Earth. Are also the shareholders of the largest textile manufacturing companies in the world. And even the numerous popular clothing brands that turn the cotton into the clothes we wear are owned by the same group of investors. Whether we have the world's largest solar panel producers or the largest oil refineries, the shares are managed by the same companies. They own the tobacco companies, who produce all the popular tobacco brands in the world. But they also own all the major companies in the pharmaceutical industry and the scientific institutes that produce the drugs. They own the companies that produce our metals and raw materials, and the entire automobile, aircraft, and arms industry where those metals and raw materials are processed. They own the companies that build our electronics. They own the big department stores and online marketplaces, and even the payment methods that we use to pay for their products. Many of the most well-known insurance companies, banks, construction companies, telephone companies, restaurant chains, and cosmetic brands are owned by the same institutional investors. These institutional investors are, as I told you earlier, mainly investment companies, banks, and insurance companies. They are in turn also owned by shareholders. Now, what is the most amazing thing? All of these institutional investors own each other's shares, and together they form an immense network that we can compare to a pyramid. The smaller institutional investors are owned by larger investors, who in turn belong to even larger investors. The visible top of this pyramid consists of only two companies, and we have seen their names many times by now. They are Vanguard and BlackRock. BlackRock itself is owned by shareholders. And if we look at who those shareholders are, we come to a strange conclusion. We see that BlackRock's largest shareholder is Vanguard, and this is where it gets dark. Vanguard itself has a unique structure that makes it impossible to see who its shareholders or clients are. The elite who own Vanguard don't want anyone to know that they are the owners of the most powerful company on Earth. But of course, this is no secret to those who are willing to look into it.
Here's a good clip of Glenn Beck, who has a good segment on how all the world's corporations went woke at the exact same time.
the Fed, which is the biggest banks in the country, they print as much money, and then they give that to Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, and others, okay? And then they give that money to places like BlackRock, Blackstone, Vanguard, who are saying, you know, we only want to do business with companies that are woke. So then they give that money either in stock or, you know, they just come in and take over the country. They take the money that they've been given by the banks, which were given that by themselves at the Fed. And then what happens? All of these companies, they're all awash. Their stocks are doing great. And the largest investors in the company are these guys. They hold enormous leverage over the country, over the companies. And they say, like BlackRock, you know what? You're going to have to be a woke company. I mean, we have a lot of trust in you, but you'll be dangerous. You'll be dangerous. So investors put public pressure on, let's say, Apple to do a civil rights audit. Well, Apple CEO Tim Cook gets the message. He responds very lightning speed soon with a $100 million project called the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative. Now that's $100 million, not to make or improve iPhones, but to solve racial equity. That's how it works. And once a company has been brought in line through woke investor pressure, they're kept in check through ESG because, well, let's get rid of these investors. No, the banks have the standards too. That's what ESG is for. And no matter how they try to spin it, it is an enforcement mechanism for authoritarianism, period. That's it.
Now we're in a position to understand why BlackRock is allowed to monopolize all of these industries and why they're in partnership with the World Economic Forum, who itself is now securing public-private partnerships with the United Nations. Again, these companies like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Berkshire Hathaway are in association with the Roundtable organizations. Again, those are the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, the Club of Rome, Budapest, and Madrid, and the Bilderberg Group. They are the corporate state that is absorbing all the world's wealth and resources. And through public-private partnerships with the United Nations via the organizations like the World Economic Forum, they are putting the flesh on the bones for this one world government, consolidating the power into the hands of the United Nations.